It is time once again to start thinking about gifts. And once again this year, I am back with 5 easy DIY gift ideas. And again, like last year, I am getting together with my friends Shara from Woodshop Diaries and Katie from Houseful of Handmade to bring you not 5, but 15 DIY gift ideas. Now, this year I am doing something different wherein I have decided to challenge myself to make DIY gifts using scrap wood, because I really do not want to go out and buy any more wood when I have a whole ton of cut-offs and boards and plywood pieces left over from a whole bunch of projects. So my goal is to build gifts using all of this stuff. But before we get started, if you are new here, I am Anika, and my goal is to demystify DIY and inspire and empower you to build all of the things. I have a ton of tool tutorials, project ideas, and resources available for you. But if you are just getting started, you might want to grab the Power Tools Simplified Guide. It is a simple guide on the 5 most important power tools that you can get started with. It's 1-page guides, 1-page reference sheets that will help you start the right way. Now, let's go on to the projects. So for this first project, I am going to actually use up this little sliver of plywood that's left over from cutting up an entire sheet of plywood. This is about 1.5 inches wide, just over 1.5 inches, and it's actually Baltic birch, so it's got some really gorgeous layers going on in here. So we're gonna use this up for making a picture frame, and we're gonna showcase these edges in that frame. So let's get started. I set the table saw fence to 3/4 inch and ripped down that strip into 2 strips 3/4 inch wide. Next, it is time for a glue up. I applied the wood glue and aligned the strips together. Originally, I was just going to use simple clamps, but I realized that I really did need to use larger clamps to keep these long strips aligned. Once it was dried overnight, I sent it through the planer, and now I have this beautiful strip with plywood layers. It's time to cut it down, so I set my miter saw to 45 degrees and started making the cuts. Now, my best advice for making these cuts and getting accurate results is to leave the saw set at an angle and then just flip the board to make the cuts. It can take a little bit of a thought process to get the right direction of the cut, but it is totally worth it to do this instead of swinging the miter saw, because that might introduce some uncertainties. And of course, remember to check the alignment of your saw before you start making these cuts. Putting it together is a simple glue up again, but this time instead of clamps, I am using a painter's tape. You want to use a good quality painter's tape with a strong adhesive to keep everything in place. I just applied glue and pulled the pieces tightly and taped them together, and repeated it for all of the pieces until I had a full frame glued up. I tried to wipe away as much of the glue squeeze out as possible and added a few more pieces of tape across the joints to keep it nice and tight. And then we measure for square, and everything is square. Now this just needs to dry up overnight. So this has been drying overnight, and it's time for the truth. Let's see how this turned out. So it does seem pretty solid, but we will see what it looks like once I take it apart. So of course there's the wood glue that is sort of sticking to the tape. This tape itself has pretty high stickiness. Gotta get all the little teeny bits and pieces off. And it's done, and it's quite solid. I gave it a quick sanding to remove all of the residue. And now it's time to route out the step for the picture to sit in. I am using a rabbiting bit, which I first tested on a piece of scrap board to get the right height. The depth needs to be able to accommodate the plexiglass, the picture, and the backing. Once I had that dialed in, I routed out this step on the inside of the picture frame. The routed leaves the corners rounded because the bit is rounded. So I cleaned that out with a chisel, and now that I have my step made, I can get the exact measurements and transfer that over onto the plexiglass and cut that down so I have the perfect fit. And I also cut down the backing, which basically I'm just using a thick shipping box. And everything fits in perfectly. It is time for the finish. To make the plywood edges pop, I used an oil finish. I decided to apply the oil first because that way when I paint the edge and I get it on the plywood, it would be really easy to wipe off. But to be honest, I should have taped off the edges to keep the oil from getting over there because there ended up being some spots that the paint just wasn't sticking to. I was very careful about not letting paint get on the front of the picture frame, but I didn't care too much about the back, as you can see. I added some backing clips and sawtooth hangers, and then it's time to put in the plexiglass, followed by the picture and the backing. And the frame is done. I absolutely love how this turned out with the visible layers that align so beautifully, and it makes such a beautiful gift. Now we're going to be building a footrest that goes under the desk. And it's very important, especially if you're spending hours and hours at the computer or at a desk, to have your feet elevated to give you that ergonomic posture. And especially having the footrest is going to relieve pressure on your thighs and keep your circulation going. And it just makes it so super comfortable. Now, this project I actually built back in 2017, and it has been super popular. It actually makes a really, really good gift for somebody who you know spends time at the desk. And so many people have built it. It's pretty straightforward to build, except there's like this angled cut that can throw some people off. And since I don't have a video, I get a lot of questions about it. So I thought this is a great time to use up some scrap wood, build some projects, and give you the video that has been so requested. So let's start building. Now for this project, I need a 1x8 board, which I actually already have right here. And we are going to be using this. You only need about 12 inches of this board. So this is a little over 12 inches. So I'm going to cut that down. Plus you need 1x3 boards. And I went through my pile and found these 1x3 pieces, these cutoffs of boards that I had actually used in the console table build recently. So I have the 1x3 board and the 1x8 boards, and let's start building. The cut list is in the plans, but basically all the cuts are at 12 inches. So I set up a stop block and I made all of the cuts, including all of the 1x3 boards that are going to be on top of the footrest. Okay, we are ready to make the cuts for the sides. Now the sides are actually at an angle so that your footrest sits at an angle. And the typical angle is between 10 to 20 degrees. And because I cannot have a variable angle, I could design something with variable angles, but I wanted to keep this simple. So we're going to go with one static angle, which is the middle angle, the 15-degree angle. So you don't have to do any of those calculations. I've already done them for you. I have the exact length that you need to measure and exactly how you need to measure in the plans that are linked below. But let me show you exactly how to measure and mark for that. So we are going to measure 5 1/4 inch from up here, right there, and a 5 1/4 inch in the other direction from this edge, right there. And then we are going to measure 2 inches from here, which actually it does end up being 2 inches on each side. So essentially what we are going to do is we're going to cut along this line. So I'm actually just going to use a straight edge right here and mark that line. There you go. So now all I need to do is cut along this line. And to do that, we're going to use a jigsaw. Now, cutting it with the jigsaw is where people find it the most challenging. So let me show you exactly how I go about cutting this. Since my line is running this way and I know I have more space here, I'm going to use that corner over here and clamp it. So I'm going to try to keep it as much at the corner as possible. Make sure that this line clears the table so I'm not cutting my table, and it's nice and tightly clamped. It's not going anywhere. Now, I know that on my jigsaw, the distance from the blade to the base plate, edge of the base plate, is 1.5 inches. It's actually 1/8 under 1.5 inches. So I am going to use that reading and mark on my board right here. So we go 1.5 inches right there, and then 1.5 inches on this end. And now I can take a straight edge, line it up with that, which, as it turns out, is interfering with the clamp. So let's loosen that clamp, move that to the side a little bit more. Okay, now we've got the straight edge over there and at this corner. Now that the straight edge is there, we can clamp the straight edge to my board right there. And now I could actually just put this clamp on top of this so that everything is clamped together. Make sure everything's still aligned. There you go. We've got everything lined up, and now I can just go ahead and make my cut. And there we have the two pieces, and they are identical. Now, this is a good time to sand all of these before we start putting them together. But before sanding, you definitely want to have all your protective gear. Okay, so we've got our sides and we've got the slats, and it's time to start putting it all together. And to do that, I'm going to use a nail gun. Now remember, if you do not have a nail gun, you can totally use a drill driver and trim head screws. But the nail gun just makes it quick and easy. And of course, we don't want to forget the wood glue. The best and the easiest way to attach all of these boards together is to start with either the top or the bottom slat. I started with the top slat and I made sure everything was aligned and I attached it. And then I went ahead and attached the bottom slat, which again, making sure everything was aligned. And once both of these slats are attached, it gives us a nice sturdy structure. So now we can just go ahead and use a 1x spacer and attach the rest of the slats. And this is basically it. It's a super simple project and it makes a really, really great gift. Now, these edges over here are just a little sharp, so I'm actually going to run the sander over it to give it a little bit of smoothness. I thought about running a router, but I think that's overkill. We'll just use a sander and sort of smoothen the corners. I stained it and added a couple coats of clear coat because it's really important to make sure that it doesn't get scuffed. And that's it. It's a super easy custom built footrest that makes a great gift. So this jewelry holder is probably the easiest project in this lineup. And to make that, I am going to be using 1x3 boards. These are cutoffs I have left over from the console table that I built. And we need some dowels. So I have some leftover dowels from back when I built the laundry room drying racks. These are 5/8 inch dowels. So we only need 2 of these. Let's make the cuts. There's only about 3 boards in this whole project, and the cut list tells you exactly what length to make it. I cut them down on my miter saw, but you can also use a circular saw or even a jigsaw for that matter to make the cuts. I also cut down the dowels to the lengths that I needed. Now this is totally optional, but I decided that I wanted to make the top of my jewelry holder rounded. So I marked the center of the board and used a round edge to draw the line that I wanted to cut. Then I clamped both the boards together so that I got the identical shape and used my jigsaw to make that cut. And once it was cut, I used my sander to even out any of the unevenness you can get from a jigsaw. Now that's done, but I decided I wanted to elevate the jewelry holder a little bit more. So I decided to add a 1/4 inch round over on both sides of these boards. So basically these boards would look nice and smooth and rounded on all edges. So I used my trim router and made those round overs. Now it's time to make the holes to attach the dowels. Now these are about 1 inch from the top, but they are staggered. So when you hang the jewelry, they don't hit each other. So once I marked the location, I used a 5/8 inch Forstner bit to make the holes about 1/2 inch deep. I just eyeball it until the top of the Forstner bit is level with the surface of the board. Now to add the dowels, I added wood glue and I put the dowels in. If you want to make this process faster, you could always use some finished nails from the other side and add them. These dowels are nice and tight in there, so once the glue dries, they're all good to go. Now on the base, I wanted to make a few little spots for rings or earrings to go. So I marked the exact locations and used a 1 inch Forstner bit to make those holes. At this point, I also decided to add a round over to the top edge of the base. Now after a couple of hours, once the wood glue for the dowels has dried, it is time to put it all together. And this is super straightforward because all I need to do was add some wood glue, align the sides to the base, and attach using finished nails. I wiped off all of the wood glue so there's no residue and sanded everything possible, wiped it all down and applied pre-stain conditioner followed by wood stain and then a few coats of top coat. And we have a simple yet beautiful jewelry holder. Now this tabletop book rack is going to be a fun project because it uses all 1x2 boards. There are a bunch of little tiny cuts that we're going to use a stop block to set up on the miter saw and make those cuts. You could also use a table saw for it if you wanted to, but we are going to put it all together using dowels. So let's go ahead and make those cuts. The cut list is in the plans and there are a bunch of small cuts, about 3 inch and even there's a 2 3/4 inch cut. So the easiest and the safest way to make that cut is using a stop block. So that's what I did and I made all of the cuts. So I have all of the 1x2s ready to go. Now I'm going to be using a dowel jig to make the joints so that we get hidden joints. So the way this is going to go together is we have this little thing that joins like this, and then we have the top or the other end that joins like this, and then we have these two that kind of go between this and this piece. So I'm going to start with making joints right here. So we're going to build this, I'm going to build this, then I'm going to attach the long pieces to this, and then we'll put it together. I think that the most important part of using dowel joinery and putting together joints with the dowel is to make sure that you mark every single board, every direction where they align, and exactly where each of the dowel holes go. Now, normally I would always recommend to use at least 2 dowels on every joint because that's going to help with alignment, and also one dowel acts as a pivot point so the boards can rotate around it as you are joining them, which will throw everything out of alignment. However, I only had a 3/8 inch dowel jig and didn't have the time to go out and buy the 1/4 inch dowel jig. And I can only fit one 3/8 inch dowel at the end of a 1x2. However, a 1/4 inch dowel jig with 1/4 inch dowels will solve this problem. So if you are going to be building this project and you can buy a jig for this project specifically, I would highly recommend getting a 1/4 inch dowel jig and building this. You will see what I mean about the twists at the very end of the project. Once again, I want to reiterate that as you're building this, you want to make sure you are remembering which direction the holes are being made, because you can see that I made a mistake and made a hole at the top of the board by accident. That's okay. I'm going to go ahead and fill it in with another dowel, cut it off, sand it in, and put it towards the bottom of the book rack. But learn from my mistakes. Make sure that you pay attention to exactly the location that you are making the holes. Mark them and follow the markings. You can see I went really overboard with all of the markings, especially when it came to that long stretcher to attach between the two ends. And putting this together is when I really realized that everything was twisting so much, and it was really hard to keep everything aligned as I was clamping. So I tried my very best. In the end, there is a slight twist to the entire thing, so one of the ends doesn't sit properly on the table. But I make these mistakes so that you don't, so make sure to use the 1/4 inch dowel jig so you have 2 dowels so you don't get any twisting. In the end, it's one of those projects that looks fancy, but it's actually super simple to build, and it works pretty much for anyone. Readers, cooks, students, teachers, or that friend who always has a stack of books on their nightstand. Now for this next project, I may have cheated a little bit. I originally had this 3/4 inch piece of oak. It's a beautiful piece of oak, and I have a few more pieces of oak that I was going to put together for this project. But I realized as I was designing it that it was becoming a little too bulky, and it would actually look a lot better if I incorporated some parts with 1/2 inch boards. So I did go out and purchase a 1/2 inch oak board as well. So let's get to building. So there are 3 pieces of 3/4 inch oak, one for the top, one for the bottom, and one for the very bottom that's going to have the Lazy Susan hardware. And then I used 1/2 inch oak boards for the panels that are going to hold the spices. Each panel is going to fit a 2x4 matrix, hence 8 spices. So I calculated the spacings and marked the center of the holes that needed to be made. So in total, the spice rack will hold 16 spices. I made the holes on my drill press using a 1 3/4 inch drill bit. This is a size that I found that worked best for my spice bottles, but of course when you build it, you might want to double check the size of the Forstner bit that you would need. At this point, I decided to add a little round over to each of the holes to give it a more polished look. This is, of course, something that's completely optional. To do this, I had to clamp both of the boards together. I had to make sure they were well aligned so that I had enough thickness for the router bit to ride over and also not mess up my work table. Now this is a good time to sand down all of the boards to remove any splinters or imperfections. Now it's time to put it all together, which is very straightforward. I used wood glue, clamps, and finish nails to attach everything. Now originally when I was going to use all 3/4 inch boards, I was going to use dowels, but with 1/2 inch boards, that is not possible. But really, the wood glue works just as well. The nails are there just to hold it in place while the glue dries. I could have totally skipped the nails, but I was running short on time to let just the glue and the clamps do their thing. But I was actually pleasantly surprised how almost invisible the nails are in the finished project. And with the structure done, it was time to test out with the spice bottles, and it worked so well. Once again, I decided it was time for a little round over with my router to soften all of the edges. I sanded the joints a little bit to remove any glue residue and got ready to stain. Now originally I was planning to leave this natural, but I thought it needed a little bit of warmth, so I started using a light walnut stain, but I kind of regret it because I think it's a little bit too dark. But also, I think it probably works fine. Let me know what you think. Now finally, it is time to attach the Lazy Susan hardware. I found the diagonals on the base and marked the location of the screws. Also, next to that, I drilled a larger hole with a 3/4 inch Forstner bit. This is going to help attach the Lazy Susan to the main spice rack later. Then it is just a matter of pre-drilling the holes and attaching it using 1/2 inch wood screws. To attach to the spice rack, I used the large hole to see, align, and access the Lazy Susan and attach it. And it is done, and it's time to load it up. This is one of those projects where I really wanted to build it, and I kind of procrastinated on it because I wasn't sure how complex it would be, but it actually ended up being so easy. And of course, I do have the plans for you to build this in the description below. And there you have it. Super simple, easy DIY projects that make amazing gift ideas, and you can pretty much build all of these or each one of them within a day, if not a weekend. Remember, I have the detailed plans for all of these linked in the description below. And don't forget to check out my friends' projects. I am going to link their videos in the description as well. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time with another fun video.